Hello and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. Tonight we begin our reading of The Star Beast by Robert Heinlein. Did your dog ever get loose? What if your truck got loose and began acting like a dog? Chapter 1. L Day. Lummox was bored and hungry. The latter was a normal state. Creatures of Lummox's breed were always ready for a little snack, even after a full meal. Being bored was less usual and derived directly from the fact that Lummox's chum and closest associate, John Thomas Stewart, had not been around all day, having chosen to go off somewhere with his friend Betty. One afternoon was a mere nothing. Lummox could hold his breath that long. But he knew the signs and understood the situation. John Thomas had reached the size and age when he would spend more and more time with Betty and others like her, and less time with Lummox. Then there would come a fairly long period during which John Thomas would spend practically no time with Lummox, but at the end of which there would arrive a new John Thomas, which would presently grow large enough to make an interesting playmate. From experience, Lummox recognized this cycle as necessary and inevitable. Nevertheless, the immediate prospect was excruciatingly boring. He lumbered listlessly around the backyard of the Stewart home, looking for anything, a grasshopper, a robin, anything at all that might be worth looking at. He watched a hill of ants for a while. They seemed to be moving house. An endless chain was dragging little white grubs in one direction, while a countermarching line returned for more grubs. This killed half an hour. Growing tired of ants, he moved away toward his own house. His number 7 foot came down on the anthill and crushed it, but the fact did not come to his attention. His own house was just big enough for him to back into it, and was the end building of a row of decreasing size. The one at the far end would have made a suitable doghouse for a Chihuahua. Piled outside his shed were 6 bales of hay. Lummox pulled a small amount off one bale and chewed it lazily. He did not take a second bite, because he had taken as much as he thought he could steal and not have it noticed. There was nothing to stop him from eating the entire pile, except the knowledge that John Thomas would bawl him out bitterly and might even refuse for a week or more to scratch him with the garden rake. The household rules required Lummox not to touch food other than natural forage until it was placed in his manger. Lummox usually obeyed, as he hated dissension and was humiliated by disapproval. Besides, he did not want hay. He had had hay for supper last night. He would have it again tonight and again tomorrow night. Lummox wanted something with more body and a more interesting flavor. He ambled over to the low fence which separated the several acres of backyard from Mrs. Stewart's formal garden, stuck his head over, and looked longingly at Mrs. Stewart's roses. The fence was merely a symbol marking the line he must not cross. Lummox had crossed it once, a few years earlier, and had sampled the rose bushes. Just a sample, a mere appetizer, but Mrs. Stewart had made such a fuss that he hated to think about it even now. Shuddering at the recollection, he backed hastily away from the fence. But he recalled some rose bushes did not belong to Mrs. Stewart, and therefore, in Lummox's opinion, did not belong to anybody. They were in the garden of the Donahues next door. There was a possible way, which Lummox had been thinking about lately, to reach these ownerless rose bushes. The Stewart place was surrounded by a 10-foot concrete wall. Lummox had never tried to climb over it, although he had nibbled the top of it in places. In the rear there was one break in it where the gully draining the land crossed the property line. The gap in the wall was filled by a massive grating of 8x8 timbers, bolted together with extremely heavy bolts. The vertical timbers were set in the stream bed, and the contractor who had erected it had assured Mrs. Stewart that it would stop Lummox or a herd of elephants or anything else too big-hipped to crawl between the timbers. Lummox knew that the contractor was mistaken, but his opinion had not been asked, and he had not offered it. John Thomas had not expressed an opinion either, but he had seemed to suspect the truth. He had emphatically ordered Lummox not to tear the grating down. Lummox had obeyed. He had sampled it for flavor, but the wooden timbers had been soaked in something which gave them a really unbearable taste. He let them be. But Lummox felt no responsibility for natural forces. He had noticed about 3 months back that spring rains had eroded the gully so that 2 of the vertical timbers were no longer embedded but were merely resting on the dry stream bed. Lummox had been thinking about this for several weeks and had found that a gentle nudge tended to spread the timbers at the bottom. A slightly heavier nudge might open up a space wide enough without actually tearing down the grating. Lummox lumbered down to check up. Still more of the stream bed had washed away in the last rain. One of the vertical timbers hung a few inches free of the sand. The one next to it was barely resting on the ground. Lummox smiled like a simple-minded gollywog and carefully, delicately insinuated his head between the 2 big posts. He pushed gently. Above his head came a sound of rending wood, and the pressure suddenly relieved. Startled, Lummox pulled his head out and looked up. The upper end of one 8x8 had torn free of its bolts. It pivoted now on a lower horizontal girder. Lummox clucked to himself. Too bad, but it couldn't be helped. Lummox was not one to weep over past events. What has been must be. No doubt John Thomas would be vexed, but in the meantime here was an opening through the grating. He lowered his head like a football lineman, set himself in low gear, and pushed on through. There followed several sounds of protesting and rending wood, and sharper ones of broken bolts, but Lummox ignored it all. He was on the far side now, a free agent. He paused and raised up like a caterpillar, lifting legs 1 and 3, 2 and 4 off the ground, and looked around. It was certainly nice to be outside. He wondered why he had not done it sooner. It had been a long time since John Thomas had taken him out, even for a short walk. He was still looking around, sniffing free air, when an unfriendly character charged at him, yapping and barking furiously. Lummox recognized him, an oversized and heavily muscled mastiff that ran ownerless and free in the neighborhood. They had often exchanged insults through the grating. Lummox had nothing against dogs. In the course of his long career with the Stewart family, he had known several socially, and had found them pretty fair company in the absence of John Thomas. But this mastiff was another matter. He fancied himself boss of the neighborhood, bullied other dogs, terrorized cats, and repeatedly challenged Lummox to come out and fight like a dog. Nevertheless, Lummox smiled at him, opened his mouth wide, and, in a lisping baby girl voice from somewhere very far back inside him, called the mastiff a very bad name. The dog gasped. It is likely that he did not comprehend what Lummox had said, but he did know that he had been insulted. He recovered himself and renewed the attack, barking louder than ever and raising an unholy ruckus while dashing around Lummox and making swift sorties at his flanks to nip at Lummox's legs. Lummox remained reared up, watching the dog but making no move. He did add to his earlier remark a truthful statement about the dog's ancestry and an untruthful one about his habits. They helped to keep the mastiff berserk. But on the dog's 7th round trip, he cut fairly close to where Lummox's first pair of legs would have been had Lummox had all 8 feet on the ground. Lummox ducked his head the way a frog strikes at a fly. His mouth opened like a wardrobe trunk and gobbled the mastiff. Not bad, Lummox decided as he chewed and swallowed. Not bad at all. And the collar made a crunchy tidbit. He considered whether or not to go back through the grating now that he had never had a little snack and pretend that he had never been outside at all. However, there were still those ownerless rose bushes, and no doubt John Thomas would make it inconvenient for him to get out again soon. He ambled away parallel to the Stewart's rear wall, then swung around the end onto the Donahue land. John Thomas Stewart XI got home shortly before dinner time, having already dropped Betty Sorensen at her home. He noticed as he landed that Lummox was not in sight, but he assumed that his pet was in his shed. His mind was not on Lummox, but on the age-old fact that females do not operate by logic, at least as logic is understood by males. He was planning to enter Western Tech. Betty wanted them both to attend the State University. He'd pointed out that he could not get the courses he wanted at State U. Betty had insisted that he could, and had looked up references to prove her point. He had rebutted by saying that it was not the name of a course that mattered, but who taught it. The discussion had fallen to pieces when she had refused to concede that he was an authority. He had absent-mindedly unstrapped his harness copter while dwelling on the illogic of the feminine mind, and was racking it in the hallway when his mother burst into his presence. "John Thomas, where have you been?" He tried to think what he could have slipped on now. It was a bad sign when she called him John Thomas. John or Johnny was okay, or even Johnny Boy, but John Thomas usually meant that he had been accused, tried, and convicted in absentia. "Huh? Why, I told you at lunch, Mum, out hopping with Betty. We flew over to—" "Never mind that. Do you know what that beast has done?" Now he had it. Lummox. He hoped it wasn't Mum's garden. Maybe Lum had just knocked over his own house again. If so, Mum would level off presently. Maybe he had better build a new one, bigger. "What's the trouble?" he asked cautiously. "What's the trouble? What isn't the trouble? John Thomas, this time you simply will have to get rid of it. This is the last straw." "Take it easy, Mum," he said hastily. "We can't get rid of Lum. You promised Dad." She made no direct answer. "With the police calling every 10 minutes and that great dangerous beast rampaging around and—" "Huh? Wait a minute, Mum. Lum isn't dangerous. He's gentle as a kitten. What happened?" "Everything." He gradually drew out of her some of the details. Lummox had gone for a stroll, that much was clear. John Thomas hoped without conviction that Lummox had not got any iron or steel while he was out. Iron had such an explosive effect on his metabolism. There was the time Lummox had eaten the second-hand Buick. His thoughts were interrupted by his mother's words. "And Mrs. Donahue is simply furious, and well she might be. Her prize roses—" Oh, that was bad. He tried to recall the exact amount in his savings account. He would have to apologize, too, and think of ways to butter up the old biddy. In the meantime, he would beat Lummox's ears with an axe. Lummox knew about roses. There was no excuse. "Look, Mum, I'm awfully sorry. I'll go right out and pound some sense into his thick head. When I get through with him, he won't dare sneeze without permission." John Thomas started edging around her. "Where are you going?" she demanded. "Huh? Out to talk with Lum, of course. When I get through with him—" "Don't be silly. He isn't here." "Huh? Where is he?" John Thomas swiftly rearranged his prayers to hope that Lummox hadn't found very much iron. The Buick hadn't really been Lummox's fault, and anyhow it had belonged to John Thomas, but no telling where he is now. Chief Dressier said— "The police are after Lummox? You can just bet they are, young man. The entire safety patrol is after him. Mr. Dressier wanted me to come downtown and take him home, but I told him we would have to wait for you to handle that beast." "But, Mother, Lummox would have obeyed you. He always does. Why did Mr. Dressier take him downtown? He knows Lum belongs here. Being taken downtown would frighten Lum. The poor baby is timid. He wouldn't like—" "Poor baby, indeed. He wasn't taken downtown." "But you said he was." "I said no such thing. If you'll be quiet, I will tell you what happened." It appeared that Mrs. Donahue had surprised Lummox when he had eaten only 4 or 5 of her rose bushes. With much courage and little sense, she had run at him with a broom to scream and belabor him about the head. She had not followed the mastiff, though he could have managed her with one gulp. Lummox had a sense of property as nice as that of any house cat. People were not food. In fact, people were almost invariably friendly. So his feelings were hurt. He had lumbered away from there, pouting. The next action report on Lummox was for a point 2 miles away and about 30 minutes later. The Stewarts lived in a suburban area of Westville, open country, separated it from the main part of town. Mr. Ito had a small farm in this interval where he hand-raised vegetables for the tables of gourmets. Mr. Ito apparently had not known what it was that he had found pulling up his cabbages and gulping them down. Lummox's long residence in the vicinity was certainly no secret, but Mr. Ito had no interest in other people's business and had never seen Lummox before. But he showed no more hesitation than had Mrs. Donahue. He dashed into his house and came out with a gun that had been handed down to him from his grandfather, a relic of the Fourth World War of the sort known affectionately as a tank killer. Mr. Ito steadied the gun on a potting bench and let Lummox have it where he would have sat down had Lummox been constructed for such. The noise scared Mr. Ito, he had never heard the weapon fired, and the flash momentarily blinded him. When he blinked his eyes and recovered, the thing had gone. But it was easy to tell the direction in which it had gone. This encounter had not humiliated Lummox as had the brush with Mrs. Donahue. This frightened him almost out of his wits. While busy with his fresh green salad, he had been faced toward a triplet of Mr. Ito's greenhouses. When the explosion ticked him and the blast assailed his hearing, Lummox shifted into high gear and got underway in the direction he was heading. Ordinarily, he used a leg-firing order of 1-4-5-8-2-3-6-7, and repeat, good for speeds from a slow crawl to fast as a trotting horse. He now broke from a standing start into a double-ended gallop, moving legs 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 together, alternated with 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. Lummox was through the 3 greenhouses before he had time to notice them, leaving a tunnel suitable for a medium truck. Straight ahead, 3 miles away, lay downtown Westville. It might have been better if he had been headed in the opposite direction toward the mountains. John Thomas Stewart listened to his mother's confused account with growing apprehension. When he heard about Mr. Ito's greenhouses, he stopped thinking about his savings account and started wondering what assets he could convert into cash. His jump harness was almost new, but shucks, it wouldn't pay the damage. He wondered if there was any kind of a dicker he could work with the bank. One thing was sure, Mum wouldn't help him out, not the state she was in. Later reports were spotty. Lummox seemed to have gone across country until he hit the highway leading into town. A transcontinental trucker had complained to a traffic officer over a cup of coffee that he had just seen a robot peditruck with no license plates, and the darn thing had been paying no attention to traffic lanes. But the trucker had used it as an excuse to launch a diatribe about the danger of robot drivers and how there was no substitute for a human driver sitting in the cab and keeping his eyes open for emergencies. The traffic patrolman had not seen Lummox, being already at his coffee when Lummox passed, and had not been impressed since the trucker was obviously prejudiced. Nevertheless, he had phoned in. Traffic Control Center in Westville paid no attention to the report. Control was fully occupied with a reign of terror. John Thomas interrupted his mother. Has anybody been hurt? Hurt? I hardly know. Probably. John Thomas, you've got to get rid of that beast at once. He ignored that statement. It seemed the wrong time to argue it. What else happened? Mrs. Stewart did not know in detail. Near the middle of town, Lummox came down a local chute from the overhead freeway. He was moving slowly now and with hesitation. Traffic and large numbers of people confused him. He stepped off the street onto a slidewalk. The walk ground to a stop. Not being designed for 6 tons of concentrated load, fuses had blown, circuit breakers had opened, and pedestrian traffic at the busiest time of day was thrown into confusion for 20 blocks of the shopping district. Women had screamed, children and dogs had added to the excitement, safety officers had tried to restore order, and poor Lummox, who had not meant any harm and had not intended to visit the shopping district anyway, made a perfectly natural mistake. The big display window of the Bon Marché looked like a refuge where he could get away from it all. The duraglass of the windows was supposed to be unbreakable, but the architect had not counted on Lummox mistaking it for empty air. Lummox went in and tried to hide in a model bedroom display. He was not very successful. John Thomas's next question was cut short by a thump on the roof. Someone had landed. He looked up. "You expecting anyone, Mum?" "It's probably the police. They said they would—" "The police? Oh, my! Don't go away. You've got to see them." "I wasn't going anywhere," he answered miserably, and punched a button to unlock the roof entrance. Moments later, the lazy lift from the roof creaked to a stop, and the door opened. A safety sergeant and a patrolman stepped out. "Mrs. Stewart," the sergeant began formally, "in your service, ma'am, we—" He caught sight of John Thomas, who was trying not to be noticed. "Are you John T. Stewart?" John gulped. "Yes, sir." "Then come along right away. Excuse us, ma'am. Or do you want to come too?" "Me? Oh, no, I'd just be in the way." The sergeant nodded relieved agreement. "Yes, ma'am. Come along, youngster. Minutes count." He took John by the arm. John tried to shrug away. "Hey, what is this? You got a warrant or something?" The police officer stopped, seemed to count 10, then said slowly, "Son, I do not have a warrant, but if you are the John T. Stewart I'm looking for, and I know you are, then unless you want something drastic and final to happen to that deep space what's-it you've been harboring, you'd better snap to and come with us." "Oh, I'll come," John said hastily. "Okay, don't give me any more trouble." John Thomas Stewart kept quiet and went with him. In the 3 minutes it took the patrol car to fly downtown, John Thomas tried to find out the worst. Mr. Patrol Officer, there hasn't been anybody hurt, has there?" "Sergeant Mendoza," the sergeant answered. "I hope not. I don't know." John considered this bleak answer. "Well, Lummox is still in the Bon Marché?" "Is that what you call it, Lummox? It doesn't seem strong enough." "No, we got it out of there. It's under the West Arroyo Viaduct, I hope." The answer sounded ominous. "What do you mean, you hope?" "Well, first we blocked off Main and Hamilton, then we chivied it out of the store with fire extinguishers. Nothing else seemed to bother it. Solid slugs just bounced off. Say, what's that beast hide made of? 10-point steel?" Not exactly." Sergeant Mendoza's satire was closer to fact than John Thomas cared to discuss. He was still wondering if Lummox had eaten any iron. After the mishap of the digested Buick, Lummox's growth had taken an enormous spurt. In 2 weeks he had jumped from the size of a misshapen hippopotamus to his present unlikely dimensions, more growth than he had shown in the preceding generation. It had made him extremely gaunt, like a canvas tarpaulin draped over a scaffolding, his quite unearthly skeleton pushing through his skin. It had taken 3 years of a high-calorie diet to make him chubby again. Since that time, John Thomas had tried to keep metal away from Lummox, most especially iron, even though his father and his grandfather had always fed him tidbits of scrap metal. Anyhow, the fire extinguishers dug him out, only he sneezed and knocked 2 men down. After that, we used more fire extinguishers to turn him down Hamilton, meaning to herd him into open country where he couldn't do so much damage, seeing as how we couldn't find you. We were making out pretty well, with only an occasional lamppost knocked down or ground cars stepped on or such, when we came to where we meant to turn him off on Hillcrest and head him back to your place. But he got away from us and headed out onto the viaduct, ran into the guardrail and went off, and, well, you'll see right now. Here we are. Half a dozen police cars were hovering over the end of the viaduct. Surrounding the area were many private air cars and an Airbus or two. The patrol cars were keeping them back from the scene. There were several hundred harness flyers as well, darting like bats in and out among the vehicles and making the police problem more difficult. On the ground, a few regular police, supplemented by emergency safety officers wearing armbands, were trying to hold the crowd back and were diverting traffic away from the viaduct and from the freight road that ran under it down the Arroyo. Sergeant Mendoza's driver threaded his way through the cars in the air while speaking into the mic on his chest. Chief Dressier's bright red command car detached itself from the knot over the end of the viaduct and approached them. Both cars stopped a few yards apart and 100 feet above the viaduct. John Thomas could see the big gap in the railing where Lummox had gone over, but could not see Lummox himself. The viaduct blocked his view. The door of the command car opened and Chief Dressier leaned out. He looked harassed and his bald head was covered with sweat. "Tell the steward boy to stick his head out." John Thomas ran a window down and did so. "Here, sir." "Lad, can you control that monster?" "Certainly, sir." "I hope you're right. Mendoza, land him. Let him try it." "Yes, Chief." Mendoza spoke to the driver, who moved the car past the viaduct and started letting down beyond it. Lummox could be seen then. He had taken refuge under the end of the bridge, making himself small. For him. John Thomas leaned out and called to him. "Lummy! Lummy boy! Come to Papa!" And perhaps Lummy will come to Papa next time.